It's the month of Halloween, and some of you may be dressing up, knocking on doors for treats and apple bobbing. But some of you don't think the Hallmark version is quite enough, and something a little darker is needed to really feel the holiday spirit, quite literally. In bathrooms across the world, many dare to lock the doors, turn down the lights, and look into a mirror, repeating the infamous name, Bloody Mary. But where did this legend come from? Who was Bloody Mary? And why do scientists believe they've discovered the reason behind the legend? Welcome to the mysteries of mythology. Bloody Mary. Welcome back, mystics. Here's the thing about Bloody Mary and any other urban legend. They never have a clear beginning. The tale of Bloody Mary is a puzzle with pieces scattered across centuries and continents. In this video, we're going to explore the various versions of who Bloody Mary might have been. Was she a cruel queen, a murderous countess, a vengeful witch, or perhaps just a tragic young girl? By the end, you'll have all the pieces to decide for yourself which version feels most convincing. But maybe you're one of those brave souls who just wants to know how to summon her without caring about the backstory. Just be warned, once you know how to call her name, there's no guarantee she won't answer. The ritual of summoning Bloody Mary is like a recipe that's been passed down through generations, except everyone seems to have their own version of the ingredients. What makes this legend so fascinating is how it changes from person to person, school to school, and country to country. But despite all these variations, there are some key elements that almost always stay the same. First, you need the perfect stage for this supernatural encounter. Almost every version requires a dark room with a mirror, and 9 times out of 10, that room is a bathroom. Why a bathroom? Well, it's usually the darkest, most private space in a house, and bathrooms have that perfect combination of being both familiar and somehow unsettling when the lights go out. The darkness isn't just for atmosphere either. It's actually crucial to making the whole experience work, as we'll discover when we look at the science behind it later. Next comes the most important part, saying her name. The most common version is simply repeating Bloody Mary over and over. Some people say you need to chant it 3 times, others insist on 5. And some brave souls claim you need to say it as many as 100 times, or keep going until she actually appears. And it's not just Bloody Mary either. Depending on where you grew up, you might have heard different variations like Bloody Mary, I believe in you, or Hail Mary, or Mary Jane. There's even the truly chilling version, I killed your baby, Bloody Mary, which connects to one of the origin stories we'll explore about later. Now, just standing there and chanting apparently isn't enough for some people. Different versions of the ritual include extra actions to amp up the fear factor. You might need to spin around between each chant, hold a lit candle because everything's scarier by candlelight, prick your finger to draw a drop of blood, or, randomly, some versions say you need to flush the toilet to make her disappear after she shows up. So you've done the ritual, you've said her name, and suddenly, what exactly are you supposed to see? Well, that depends on which story you believe. Bloody Mary might appear as a bloodied ghost with a terrifying disfigured face. She could be an old witch, a young girl, or sometimes she's holding a dead baby. As for what she'll do to you, the stories range from mildly unsettling to absolutely terrifying. Most stories say she just appears behind you in the mirror, but she might scratch your face or try to claw out your eyes. She could let out an ear-piercing scream. Some say she'll curse you or steal your soul. Others claim she'll haunt you forever after that first encounter. But not all versions of Bloody Mary are evil. In some older stories, she might actually show you glimpses of your future spouse. The beauty of the Bloody Mary legend is that it's constantly evolving. Every time someone tells the story or performs the ritual, they might add their own twist, creating new versions that spread to their friends and beyond. But here's something that might surprise you. The most popular identity that people give to Bloody Mary is probably completely wrong. So who was she really? Let's start by looking at the most famous candidate. If you've ever looked up Bloody Mary online or watched a terrible one-click AI video about the legend, chances are Queen Mary I of England is the first name that pops up. Most sources commonly point to her as the source of the legend, but apart from sharing the same name, it's a common misconception that the English Queen was linked to the urban legend of the entity in the mirror. The story of Queen Mary I is absolutely fascinating and genuinely terrifying in its own right, but it's probably not the origin of our bathroom mirror ghost. Still, let's explore why she earned that bloody nickname, and why some people still believe she might be the spirit haunting our reflections. Mary Tudor became Queen Mary I when she took the throne in 1553, and she wasted no time in earning her terrifying reputation. She signed an act that launched what historians call the Marian persecutions, a brutal campaign where an estimated 240 men and 60 women were sentenced as Protestant heretics and burned alive at the stake. The sight and smell of burning flesh became tragically common during her 5-year reign. But Mary's connection to blood goes beyond just the executions. She was also known for having extremely heavy menstrual cycles, which scholars today believe was likely the result of endometriosis or possibly uterine cancer. In an age when people didn't really understand women's health, this would have seemed both mysterious and disturbing to those around her. Mary's life reads like a tragic drama. She started out as her father, Henry VIII's beloved daughter, the apple of his eye. But everything changed when Henry decided he wanted to divorce Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Anne Boleyn. The Catholic Church wouldn't allow the divorce, so Henry did something unthinkable. He changed the entire country's religion from Catholic to Protestant just so he could get his way. Suddenly, Mary went from princess to servant. She was stripped of her right to the throne and forced to work as a babysitter to her new half-sister Elizabeth. Later, when Mary did become queen, she was married off to Philip of Spain, a man who didn't love her and spent most of their marriage in other countries. Mary desperately wanted children, partly to secure her legacy, and partly, perhaps, to finally experience the love she'd been denied for so much of her life. One of the most heartbreaking parts of her story was that Mary experienced what doctors now call a phantom pregnancy. For months, her body showed all the signs of pregnancy. Her belly swelled, she felt movement, she prepared for motherhood. She was convinced she was finally going to have the child she so desperately wanted. But as the months passed, it became clear that there was no baby. Mary died at the young age of 42, childless, largely unloved, and remembered primarily for the blood she spilled in the name of her faith. It's only in recent decades that people have started connecting Queen Mary I to the mirror legend. Some modern versions of the story describe the spirit as appearing with a bloodied face, holding the ghostly form of the baby she never had. But there's no historical evidence that people were chanting Mary's name in mirrors during or shortly after her lifetime. The Bloody Mary mirror ritual seems to have appeared much later, and the connection to Queen Mary I appears to be a modern invention, probably because the nickname was just too perfect to ignore. So if it wasn't the English Queen haunting bathroom mirrors, then who could it be? Well, there's another historical figure with an even more disturbing connection to blood and young women. If Queen Mary I seems too disconnected from the legend, then perhaps we need to look at someone whose story is so disturbing, so drenched in blood and horror, that she could absolutely be the spirit people summon in dark bathrooms. Meet Elizabeth Báthory, the Hungarian noblewoman known throughout history as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth was born into incredible wealth and power in 1560. Her family owned vast estates across Hungary, and she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a powerful nobleman who was often away fighting wars. This left Elizabeth alone in her massive castle with almost unlimited power over the peasants and servants who lived on her lands. And that's where this story takes a truly horrific turn. According to historical accounts and court records, Elizabeth became obsessed with maintaining her youth and beauty. But her methods weren't face creams or healthy living. They were far, far more sinister. She believed that bathing in the blood of young virgin girls would keep her skin soft and make her look forever young. The stories of what happened in Elizabeth's castle are so disturbing they're hard to believe, but they come from court testimony and investigations. She would lure young peasant girls to work as servants in her castle, promising them good wages and comfortable living conditions. Instead, these girls walked into a nightmare. Elizabeth and her servants would torture these young women in ways that are almost too horrific to describe. They would beat them, burn them with hot irons, freeze them in the winter cold, and use needles and knives to inflict incredible pain. The torture wasn't quick. It could go on for days or even weeks. And when the girls finally died from their injuries, Elizabeth would drain their blood and bathe in it, believing it would preserve her youth. But Elizabeth's cruelty didn't stop there. When she began to notice that peasant blood wasn't giving her the results she wanted, she decided she needed higher quality blood. So she started targeting young noble women, girls from wealthy families who wouldn't be ignored if they disappeared. This was her fatal mistake. When the daughters of nobility began vanishing, people started asking questions. In 1610, Elizabeth's own cousin, Count Georgi Thurzo, led an investigation into the castle. What they found was beyond horrific. They discovered torture chambers, cells full of dying girls, and evidence of unimaginable cruelty. The official count was that Elizabeth had murdered over 600 young women, though some historians believe the number could have been even higher. Each one tortured and killed to feed one woman's vanity and madness. Elizabeth was never formally tried. Her noble status protected her from public execution. Instead, she was walled up alive in her own castle with just small slits for food and air. She lived like this for 4 years until her death in 1614, imprisoned by the walls of the place where she had committed her crimes. Recent sources claim that the accusations were created to destroy her family's influence in the region, which was considered a threat to the political interests of her neighbours, including the Habsburg Empire. But many of the contemporary historians swore the stories to be true. Elizabeth's story spread throughout Europe and became the inspiration for countless vampire legends. The idea of someone preserving their youth through the blood of others, someone who was both beautiful and monstrous, someone whose very name became synonymous with evil. It all fits. Unlike Queen Mary I, whose connection to the mirror legend seems to be a modern invention, Elizabeth Báthory's story contains all the elements that could have evolved into the Bloody Mary folklore over the centuries. A woman whose name you wouldn't want to say aloud, whose spirit you definitely wouldn't want to encounter in a dark room. But as compelling as Elizabeth Báthory is as a candidate, she's not the only possibility. And plus, her name wasn't Mary. There's another figure from folklore whose story might be even more directly connected to the ritual we know today. Sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that feel like they could be true, even when we're not entirely sure they actually happened. That brings us to Mary Worth, a figure who exists somewhere between history and legend, and whose story might be the most direct connection we have to the modern Bloody Mary ritual. Unlike Queen Mary I or Elizabeth Báthory, who were definitely real historical figures, Mary Worth is more elusive. Some versions of her story place her in colonial America, others in medieval Europe. and still others suggest she's entirely fictional. But regardless of whether she actually existed, her legend has become deeply connected to the Bloody Mary folklore, and her story explains many of the specific elements we see in the modern ritual. According to the most common version of the Maryworth legend, she was a woman living on the outskirts of a small village sometime in the 1600s or 1700s. She was what people would have called a wise woman or herbalist, someone who knew about plants and healing remedies. In those times, such women often lived alone on the edges of communities, and they were both sought after for their knowledge and feared for their power. But Maryworth's story takes a dark turn. The legend says she became obsessed with youth and beauty, much like Elizabeth Báthory, but her methods were different and perhaps even more sinister. Instead of targeting adults, Maryworth allegedly began kidnapping children from the village. Young children, innocent and pure, whose blood she believed held special power. The stories describe how Mary would lure children to her cottage in the woods with promises of sweets or interesting herbs to see. Once she had them in her power, she would perform dark rituals, draining their blood for her twisted purposes. Some versions say she was trying to create a potion for eternal youth. When children started disappearing from the village regularly, the townspeople began to suspect the strange woman who lived alone in the forest. They organized search parties, and eventually they found evidence of her horrible crimes. Or at least they said they did. What happened next follows the classic pattern of witch trials and mob justice. The villagers dragged Maryworth from her cottage and accused her of witchcraft, murder, and consorting with dark forces. In some versions of the story, they found the remains of the missing children hidden around her property, along with jars of blood and evidence of dark rituals. The villagers tied Maryworth to a stake and burned her alive, just as they would any accused witch. But as the flames consumed her, Maryworth supposedly screamed out a curse that would echo through the centuries. She swore that she would return from the dead if anyone was foolish enough to speak her name. She promised that those who summoned her would face the same fate as the children she had killed. Maryworth's story specifically involves mirrors, children calling her name, and the consequences of summoning her spirit. The children who typically perform the Bloody Mary ritual are exactly the same demographic that Maryworth supposedly preyed upon: young people, often girls, usually around the age when they're becoming more aware of themselves and their appearance. The mirror element is crucial too. In Maryworth's legend, mirrors aren't just random objects, they're portals, ways for her spirit to cross back into the world of the living. When children chant her name while looking into a mirror, they're supposedly giving her permission to return and continue her deadly work. The Maryworth legend also explains why so many versions of the Bloody Mary ritual involve multiple repetitions of the name. In folklore, saying someone's name multiple times is often seen as a way of binding them to you or forcing them to appear. The more times you say Maryworth's name, the stronger the summoning becomes, until she has no choice but to answer your call. But even if Maryworth provides the most direct connection to the modern ritual, she's still not the only possibility. Sometimes the most powerful legends come not from historical figures or mythical witches, but from tragedies that feel all too real and all too close to home. And be warned, the next chapter isn't for the faint-hearted. Sometimes the most haunting legends are the ones that could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. They're not about distant queens or mythical witches. They're about ordinary people who met extraordinary and tragic ends. This brings us to perhaps the most heartbreaking version of the Bloody Mary legend. The story of a young girl whose life was cut short by violence and whose spirit supposedly remains trapped between worlds, seeking justice or revenge. This version of the legend doesn't center on one specific historical figure. but rather represents a type of story that appears again and again in different communities. The details change depending on where you hear it, but the core elements remain tragically similar. A young girl, usually a teenager, meets a violent and untimely death. Her spirit, unable to find peace, begins appearing to those who call her name. One of the most common versions tells of a girl who died in a car accident, but not just any car accident. According to the legend, she was driving on a dark, winding road late at night when something went terribly wrong. Maybe she was rushing home to make curfew. Maybe she was trying to escape from someone or something dangerous. The car went off the road, crashed, and she was killed instantly. But here's where the story becomes truly horrifying. In some versions, she wasn't found for days or even weeks. When her body was finally discovered, her face was bloodied and scratched from the impact and from her desperate attempts to escape the wreckage. But there's an even more disturbing version of this legend, one that's definitely not for the faint of heart. In this telling, the girl didn't die in a car accident at all. Instead, she was the victim of a terrible crime that speaks to some of our deepest fears about safety and trust. According to this version, the girl was kidnapped by someone she thought she could trust, perhaps someone from her own community, maybe even someone she knew. After taking her, this person didn't just kill her quickly. Instead, in a moment of pure evil, he first raped her, then buried her alive. The legend says that when her body was finally found, her fingernails were torn and bloody from frantically scratching at her coffin lid, trying to escape. Her face was covered in blood from her desperate struggle for survival. She had died alone, terrified, and in unimaginable pain, with no one to hear her cries for help. When she appears in mirrors, she might be trying to warn others about the dangers she faced, or seeking revenge against a world that failed to protect her. The murdered girl version of Bloody Mary is particularly popular in urban legends because it feels believable in a way that royal conspiracies or ancient witches might not. Every community has stories of young people who died too soon, and it's easy to imagine how these real tragedies might evolve into supernatural legends over time. But while these stories of historical figures and tragic victims are compelling, they might all be missing the point entirely. Because long before any of these women lived and died, people were already performing mirror rituals for very different reasons. The Bloody Mary legend might actually be a twisted evolution of something much older and originally much more innocent. What if I told you that the terrifying Bloody Mary ritual we know today actually started as something completely innocent, something romantic, even hopeful? Long before people were summoning vengeful spirits in bathroom mirrors, young women were performing similar rituals for a very different purpose, to catch a glimpse of their future husbands. These mirror divination rituals date back centuries, long before any of our Bloody Mary candidates were even born. In an age when women had very little control over their own destinies, when marriages were often arranged by parents and love was considered less important than financial security, young girls desperately wanted some hint about what their futures might hold. A young woman would wait until late at night when the house was quiet and dark. She would light a single candle, then, walking backward up the stairs to maintain the mysterious atmosphere, she would make her way to a room with a mirror, often a bedroom or sometimes a bathroom. Once there, she would hold her candle up to the mirror and peer into the reflection, hoping to see not her own face, but the face of the man she would one day marry. The young women who performed this ritual were filled with hope and excitement. They weren't trying to summon something evil or frightening. They were seeking love, companionship, and a glimpse of happiness to come. But like all folklore, this romantic ritual came with a dark warning. The story said that not every girl would see a future husband's face in the mirror. Some unlucky young women would see something much more terrifying, a skull or the hooded figure of the Grim Reaper. This ominous vision meant that the girl would die before she ever had a chance to marry. These older rituals explain so many elements of the modern Bloody Mary legend. The mirror, the darkness, the candle, the expectation of seeing a different face looking back. All of these components were already in place centuries before our modern urban legend developed. Even the bathroom setting makes sense when you consider that bathrooms often had the best mirrors in the house and provided the privacy needed for such personal rituals. Somewhere along the way, the hopeful search for love became a terrifying encounter with death. The romantic anticipation became fearful dread. Instead of hoping to see a beloved face, people began expecting to see something horrifying. As communities became more religious, particularly in Christian societies, activities like divination and fortune-telling were increasingly seen as sinful or dangerous. The idea of trying to see the future through supernatural means went from being a harmless romantic tradition to something that could invite evil into your life. But here's what's really interesting about this historical connection. It suggests that there might not have been a single Bloody Mary at all. Instead of being the spirit of a specific person, Bloody Mary might be the evolution of an ancient ritual that tapped into something much more fundamental about human psychology and our relationship with mirrors and darkness. This brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. Why do people swear that these mirror rituals work? The answer might not be supernatural at all, but rather rooted in the fascinating ways our own brains can trick us. In 2010, a researcher named Giovanni Caputo decided to do something that most scientists probably thought was a waste of time. He actually tested whether the Bloody Mary phenomenon was real. Not the supernatural part, obviously, but whether people actually see things when they stare into mirrors in dimly lit rooms. What he discovered was so remarkable that it's been studied and replicated by researchers around the world. Caputo gathered 50 volunteers who had never heard of his experiment before, what scientists call naive subjects. He put each person alone in a room lit by just a single 25-watt bulb, about as bright as a nightlight. Then he gave them one simple instruction: stare into a mirror for 10 minutes straight and report everything you see. Now, 10 minutes might not sound like a long time, but try staring at yourself in a mirror without looking away for even that long. It's much harder than you'd think, and it starts to feel very strange very quickly. The results were absolutely mind-blowing. This wasn't just one or two people seeing weird things. This was the vast majority of participants experiencing genuine hallucinations. 66% of people saw huge deformations of their own face. But it gets even more incredible. 18% of participants saw the faces of their parents looking back at them. Some of these were parents who were still alive, but others were parents who had already died. 28% saw the face of a complete stranger. Another 28% saw what they described as archetypal faces. The face of an old woman, a young child, or what looked like an ancient ancestor. These weren't vague impressions either. The participants described these faces as clear and detailed, as if they were looking at real people. 18% saw animal faces staring back at them. Cats, pigs, lions, creatures that seemed to be watching them with intelligent eyes. And perhaps most terrifying of all, 48% saw what they described as fantastical and monstrous beings, creatures that seemed to come from nightmares, faces that were twisted, evil, or inhuman. So what's actually happening here? How can your brain literally change what you see when you know you're looking at your own reflection? Dr. Caputo believes these illusions are the result of what he calls a dissociative identity effect, which is basically a fancy way of saying that your brain's facial recognition system starts to malfunction in ways we don't fully understand yet. After staring at your own face for several minutes in dim light that doesn't illuminate your features perfectly, your brain stops recognizing the reflection as your own face. Facial recognition is actually an incredibly complex process that your brain usually handles automatically, but this system relies on having clear, well-lit images to work with. When you're staring at your reflection in dim light, your brain doesn't have all the visual information it normally needs. The shadows fall differently, details are harder to make out, and your features might appear slightly distorted. After several minutes of this, your brain essentially gives up trying to recognize the face as your own and starts filling in the gaps with other information. You might glance quickly at a coat hanging on a door and think it's a person, or see a shadow and assume it's an animal. But in the mirror experiment, this process goes into overdrive. Instead of making quick assumptions and moving on, your brain keeps trying to interpret what it's seeing, creating more and more elaborate explanations for the unclear image. This is why people see such detailed, specific faces. Their brains are essentially creating entire identities to explain what they're looking at. The really fascinating part is that this isn't random. The types of faces people see often reflect their own psychological state, their memories, their fears, and their expectations. Someone who's thinking about deceased relatives might see their grandmother. Someone who's already nervous might see frightening or evil faces. Now that we understand the science behind why people actually see things in mirrors, we can ask an even more interesting question. Why has this particular legend survived and thrived for so long? The answer reveals something fascinating about human psychology and growing up. The Bloody Mary legend isn't just a ghost story, it's what folklorists call a rite of passage disguised as a game. Think about who typically performs this ritual. It's almost always young people, usually around middle school or early high school age. This is exactly the age when kids are dealing with some of the most intense psychological and physical changes of their entire lives. Folklorist Alan Dundes has suggested that the Bloody Mary ritual is deeply connected to the anxieties of adolescence, particularly the transition into womanhood. Consider the key elements: a dark bathroom, blood, mirrors, and a female spirit who appears to young girls. The bathroom setting isn't random. It's one of the most private, intimate spaces in any home. It's where people confront their own bodies and deal with physical changes. The mirror represents self-reflection and identity, but also self-doubt and insecurity. And blood has always been associated with life, death, power, and particularly with female experiences like menstruation and childbirth. The female spirit of Bloody Mary herself represents something complex and contradictory. She embodies both the promise and the fears of womanhood. The idea that growing up means gaining power, but also facing new dangers. So, mystics, the legend of Bloody Mary isn't just one story, it's a collection of histories, fears, and psychological truths all wrapped up in a ritual that's been passed down through generations. Whether she's a vengeful queen, a murderous countess, a cursed witch, a tragic victim, or simply the evolution of an ancient love ritual, Bloody Mary represents something much deeper than a simple ghost story. She's a mirror, both literally and figuratively, reflecting our own anxieties about growing up, and our need to test our courage in a safe but thrilling way. The next time you hear someone daring their friends to say her name 3 times in a dark bathroom, you'll know they're participating in a tradition that's much older and more complex than they realize. They're connecting with centuries of human experience, fear, and the eternal challenge of growing up. So, have any of you heard a different version of the Bloody Mary story? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your own encounters with this legendary figure who continues to haunt mirrors and imaginations around the world.